John had killed 23 people in 9 years, and the thing that bothered him most about his professional name wasn't the obviousness of it, but the fact that his handler had misspelled it when setting up his operational identity and John had been too polite to correct him. So now he was John Week instead of John Wick, which made him sound less like a legendary assassin and more like someone who struggled to open pickle jars. The irony wasn't lost on him, especially since he'd spent his entire career being aggressively competent at violence while his name suggested he'd lose a fight with a particularly aggressive houseplant. The bookstore where John met Nadia was hosting an auction for rare manuscripts, which was exactly the kind of event John attended when he wasn't working because it reminded him that human civilization had produced things more interesting than the various ways to kill people efficiently. He was bidding on a first edition of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, not because he particularly cared about Rilke, but because the book had belonged to a woman he'd killed 6 years ago and buying it felt like a strange form of penance that his therapist would probably have opinions about if he'd been honest about his job during their sessions. Nadia outbid him by $200, which was annoying, but then she turned around after winning and her smile was so genuinely pleased that John found himself not caring about the book anymore. She had the kind of face that made you forget what you'd been thinking about, not because she was conventionally beautiful, though she was, but because her expressions moved through emotions with a fluidity that suggested she actually felt things deeply instead of performing feelings for social acceptance. "You really wanted this," she said, walking over to where John was pretending to browse other lots. "The Rilke. I saw you bidding." "I did," John said. "But you wanted it more, apparently." "Not really," Nadia said, and her accent placed her somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, possibly Lebanese or Syrian. "I just have a competitive problem with auctions. Once I start bidding, I can't stop until I win. It's pathological. My therapist says it's about control issues stemming from childhood." "Your therapist sounds like they get paid well," John said. "They do," Nadia agreed. "But they're also right, which is annoying because it means I can't dismiss their insights as expensive nonsense." She held out the book. "Here. Take it. I don't actually need another Rilke. I have 3 copies at home, which is probably too many for anyone who's not writing a dissertation on early 20th century German poetry." John looked at the book, then at her, trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate setup or just a genuinely kind gesture from a stranger who'd recognized that he'd wanted something she'd taken. "I can't just take a book you paid $4,000 for." "You can if I'm giving it to you," Nadia said. "Consider it an apology for my psychological issues manifesting in your general direction. Plus, you look like someone who actually reads Rilke for the right reasons, not to impress people at dinner parties." "What are the right reasons?" John asked. "To feel less alone in being completely lost," Nadia said. "Which is basically why anyone reads anything worth reading." They had coffee after that, which turned into dinner, which turned into John walking Nadia to her apartment in Brooklyn and discovering that she lived in a converted industrial building that had been renovated with the kind of money that suggested her late husband's import business had been significantly more profitable than John's cover job as a security consultant. She invited him up for a drink that they both knew wasn't really about drinking, and John found himself in her bedroom at 2 a.m. having the kind of sex that made you reconsider your entire approach to physical intimacy. "You're very good at this," Nadia said afterward, lying next to him with her head on his chest, her breathing still slightly elevated. "Which makes me think you've had practice or natural talent or possibly both." "I'm good at reading people," John said, which was true in multiple contexts. "And adapting to what they need." "That's a diplomatic way of saying you're paying attention," Nadia said. "Which is rarer than it should be. Most men approach sex like they're following IKEA instructions, very focused on completing the task but not particularly interested in whether the furniture is actually comfortable afterward." John laughed, which surprised him because he didn't laugh often, and Nadia lifted her head to look at him with an expression of delighted surprise. "You should do that more often," she said. "The laughing. It makes you look less like someone who's carrying the weight of the world and more like someone who remembers that joy exists." "I don't have a lot to laugh about," John said. "Then we should fix that," Nadia said. They saw each other 3 times a week for the next 2 months, and John found himself falling into something that felt dangerously close to domestic happiness. Nadia was smart in ways that made conversations feel like intellectual sparring matches where both people were trying to make the other person think harder rather than win. She made terrible coffee but excellent shakshuka, and she had a habit of reading out loud from whatever book she was currently obsessed with, usually while John was trying to work on his laptop and pretending to be annoyed but actually memorizing the passages she found meaningful. She told him her husband had died 3 years ago in a car accident, and that she'd inherited his import-export business, which she was now running with the help of business managers who handled the operational details while she focused on strategy and client relationships. She traveled frequently for work, usually to Europe and the Middle East, and she always brought John back books from rare bookstores in cities he'd never visited. She asked about his security consulting work with genuine curiosity, and John found himself creating elaborate cover stories that were close enough to the truth that he didn't feel like he was lying, just omitting the parts where his consulting involved eliminating people who'd become problems for organizations that paid very well for discretion. The sex got better as they learned each other's bodies with the kind of focused attention that John usually reserved for memorizing building layouts and guard rotations. Nadia liked being in control, which John found refreshing because most of his life involved making decisions about life and death, and it was nice to let someone else make decisions about something as simple as pleasure. She'd pin his wrists above his head and take her time, watching his face with an intensity that made him feel seen in ways that were both terrifying and addictive, and afterward she'd curl against him and tell him stories about her childhood in Beirut that made him understand why she developed control issues and a competitive approach to auctions. 3 months into their relationship, John's handler called with a surveillance contract. A meeting between 3 crime families who were negotiating territory agreements in the wake of a leadership vacuum left by a recent arrest. John's job was to observe, record, and identify key players so his employer could assess whether any of them needed to be eliminated before the territorial agreements solidified into something more permanent. The meeting was at a private estate in New Jersey, invitation only, and John would be posing as a driver for one of the attending families. He told Nadia he had a work trip, which wasn't unusual, and she kissed him goodbye with the kind of intensity that suggested she'd miss him even though he'd only be gone for 2 days. "Come back safe," she said, which was something she always said, and John always wondered if she somehow knew that his work involved danger even though he'd never given her any indication that security consulting was anything other than boring corporate risk assessment. The estate was exactly the kind of place where crime families held meetings, large, ostentatiously wealthy, and far enough from neighbors that screams wouldn't carry. John arrived early, positioned his recording equipment in the driver's lounge where the other security personnel would be waiting, and then settled in to watch the meeting room through a camera feed that one of the other operatives had installed in a decorative clock that no one would think to check for surveillance equipment. The first family to arrive was the Italians, traditional organized crime, looking uncomfortable in suits that were too expensive and too tight. The second family was Russian, looking comfortable in suits that cost half as much but fit perfectly. And the third family was Lebanese, arriving in luxury vehicles with security details that moved with the kind of professional precision that made John mentally catalog their positions and calculate how long it would take to eliminate all of them if necessary. And then he saw her. Nadia. Walking into the meeting room with her hand resting on the arm of a man who was clearly the head of the Lebanese family. She was wearing a dress John had never seen, something elegant and modest that covered significantly more skin than anything she wore when she was with him, and her hair was styled differently, pulled back in a way that made her look older and more formal. She sat down at the table in the seat reserved for family, not staff, and John watched through the camera feed as she leaned over to whisper something to the man beside her, who smiled and squeezed her hand with the casual intimacy of someone who'd been touching her for years. John felt something cold and sharp lodge itself in his chest, the kind of feeling he usually experienced right before killing someone, and he had to consciously control his breathing to avoid hyperventilating in a room full of other security personnel who would definitely notice if he had a panic attack. He watched the meeting with half his attention while the other half tried to process what he was seeing. Nadia. His Nadia. Sitting at a table with crime family leadership. Wearing a wedding ring he'd never seen before. Acting like she belonged in a world she'd never mentioned and a life she'd apparently been living the entire time she'd been sleeping in John's bed and reading Rilke out loud and telling him he should laugh more often. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and John recorded everything with mechanical efficiency while his brain ran through possibilities. Maybe she was undercover. Maybe she was being forced to attend. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate coincidence where someone who looked exactly like Nadia just happened to be married to a Lebanese crime boss. But when the meeting ended and John watched her kiss the man on the cheek before leaving separately in a different vehicle, he knew with absolute certainty that this was his Nadia, and she'd been lying to him about everything except possibly the quality of the sex and her opinions on German poetry. He completed the surveillance contract, delivered the recordings to his handler, and then sat in his apartment for 6 hours trying to decide what to do with this information. He could confront her. He could walk away. He could kill her, which was what he'd do if she were a target instead of someone he'd accidentally fallen in love with. But all of those options felt inadequate to the situation, and John found himself doing something he rarely did: nothing. He just waited to see what would happen next. Nadia called him the following evening, her voice warm and familiar, asking if he wanted to come over for dinner. John said yes because he needed to see her face when he asked her about New Jersey, needed to watch her expression when he told her he knew she was married to someone who ran drugs and guns and human trafficking operations through legitimate import-export businesses. He showed up at her apartment with wine he'd carefully selected to pair with whatever she was cooking, and when she opened the door wearing one of his shirts and nothing else, John felt his resolve waver because this version of her felt so completely different from the woman he'd seen at that meeting. "I missed you," she said, pulling him inside and kissing him with an enthusiasm that seemed genuine. "2 days is too long. We should implement a rule about maximum separation time." "We should talk," John said, and Nadia's expression shifted from playful to concerned with a speed that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation. "That's never a good opening," she said. "But okay. Let's talk." "Wine first, or talk first?" "Talk first," John said. "Because the wine's going to taste different after." They sat on her couch, and John watched her face carefully as he said, "I was in New Jersey 2 days ago. At a meeting. And I saw you there with a man who's definitely not your dead husband, unless your dead husband has made a remarkable recovery and also runs a Lebanese crime family." Nadia didn't look surprised, which told John she'd been waiting for this moment, possibly since the beginning. "His name is Rashid Al-Nazari," she said. "And he's not my first husband. He's my second husband. Rashid practices polygamy. I'm his junior wife." John processed this information, which somehow made everything both better and worse. "You're married." Present tense. "To a crime boss. And you've been sleeping with me for 3 months." "Yes," Nadia said. "All of those things are true." "And you didn't think this was information I might want to have before getting involved with you?" "I thought about telling you," Nadia said. "Every time we were together, I thought about it. But the truth is, I liked being someone else when I was with you. I liked being Nadia, the widow with the import business and the control issues and the terrible taste in coffee. I liked being the version of myself that could just be with someone without it being about family alliances or business strategy or sharing my husband with another woman who has seniority and makes sure I never forget it." "So I was what, exactly?" John asked. "A vacation from your real life?" "No," Nadia said, and her voice carried an intensity that made John believe her despite everything. "You were the only real part of my life. Everything with Rashid is performance. I married him because my family needed the alliance, because his first wife Leila couldn't have children and he wanted heirs, because refusing would have meant dishonoring my father and putting my entire family at risk. I've been Rashid's wife for 4 years, and I've never felt anything for him except obligation and occasional resentment. But with you, I feel everything. Every stupid, inconvenient, dangerous feeling that I've been trying not to feel because feeling them means acknowledging that I'm trapped in a life I never wanted." "Does he know about me?" John asked. "No," Nadia said. "Not yet. But he will eventually, because Leila watches everything I do. She runs his intelligence network, and she's very good at finding secrets. I've been careful, but I'm not naive enough to think I can hide this forever." "And what happens when he finds out?" John asked. "He'll kill you," Nadia said simply. "Or try to. And he'll punish me in ways that don't leave visible marks because he needs me functional for family appearances. And Leila will be smug about it because she's wanted me gone since the day I married into the family." John should have walked away. Should have thanked Nadia for being honest, finally, and then disappeared from her life before Rashid Al-Nazari discovered that someone had been sleeping with his second wife and decided that person needed to die publicly as a message about the consequences of disrespecting his family. But John looked at Nadia, at the way her hands were shaking slightly and her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying because crying would be admitting defeat, and he heard himself say something incredibly stupid. What if I don't let him kill me? Nadia laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that sounded like breaking. You can't fight an entire organization, John. You're one person. He has hundreds of people who'd kill for him without asking questions. I'm aware of the numerical disadvantage, John said. But you're assuming I'm just a security consultant who writes boring reports about risk assessment. What are you actually? Nadia asked. Someone who solves problems permanently, John said. For people who can afford permanent solutions. Nadia stared at him, and John watched understanding move across her face like weather. You're a hitman. I prefer problem solver, John said. But yes. That's the general job description. And you didn't tell me, Nadia said. Which means we've both been lying to each other about who we really are. Apparently, John said. They sat in silence for a long moment, and then Nadia started laughing for real, the kind of laugh that was edged with hysteria. This is insane. I'm married to a crime boss and sleeping with a hitman, and neither of you knew about the other until today. This is like a terrible movie plot. It really is, John agreed. So what do we do? Nadia asked. I can't leave Rashid. Leaving would mean my family loses the alliance, and without the alliance they're vulnerable to the families that have been waiting for an excuse to move against them. And you can't fight an entire organization just because you've been sleeping with someone's wife. Can't I? John asked, and he realized he actually meant it. I've done more difficult things for worse reasons. At least this time I'd be fighting for something that matters. I matter to you? Nadia asked, and her voice was smaller than John had ever heard it. Unfortunately, John said. Because if you didn't, this would be significantly easier. Nadia kissed him then, desperate and fierce, and John kissed her back while his brain calculated odds and strategies and the various ways this could end. Most of those endings involved one or both of them dead, but some of them, the unlikely ones, the ones that required precision and luck and the kind of ruthless efficiency John had spent 9 years perfecting, some of those endings involved both of them alive and Rashid Al-Nazari learning that some problems couldn't be solved with money and threats and a small army of loyal soldiers. They made love on her couch, which was different than the sex they'd had before because now it carried the weight of everything they'd revealed and everything they hadn't. And afterward, lying tangled together with her head on his chest and his hand in her hair, John said, when he finds out, what will happen first? Leila will tell Rashid, Nadia said. She'll have evidence, probably photographs or video from surveillance she's been running on me. Rashid will verify the information because he doesn't trust anyone completely, not even Leila. And then he'll decide how to respond. If he's smart, he'll just kill you quietly and punish me privately. But Rashid isn't always smart when he's angry. Sometimes he's theatrical. And if he decides to be theatrical, he'll make an example of both of us. How long do we have? John asked. I don't know, Nadia said. Could be days. Could be weeks. Depends on how carefully Leila's been watching and how much evidence she wants before going to Rashid. If you're still here, if you're watching this unfold and wondering how the hell John and Nadia are going to survive what's coming, do me a favor and hit that like button. Because this is part 1 of a 3-part story, and what happens next is going to test everything they think they know about survival, loyalty, and whether love is worth dying for. And you're going to want to see how this plays out. John spent the next week preparing for war. He moved his valuables to a secure location, liquidated accounts that could be frozen, and reached out to contacts who owed him favors or who'd be willing to sell information about the Al-Nazari family's operations. He learned that Rashid had built his empire on a combination of legitimate businesses and illegal operations, that his first wife Leila was the real power behind organizational intelligence and had built a surveillance network that would make intelligence agencies jealous, and that Rashid had a reputation for being reasonable in business but viciously vindictive when crossed personally. He also learned that Rashid's security detail rotated on a 7-day schedule, that he had safe houses in 3 states, and that his primary residence had more cameras than a casino and more armed guards than a military installation. Fighting Rashid head-on would be suicide. But creating chaos, exploiting vulnerabilities, and making Rashid's people question their loyalty through a campaign of psychological warfare and strategic eliminations, that might be survivable. Nadia called John on day 8 with a voice that was trying to sound calm but failing. "Leila knows," she said. "She just told me. Showed me photographs of us together. At your apartment. At restaurants. She's been watching for 6 weeks. Has she told Rashid?" John asked. "Not yet," Nadia said. "She wanted to tell me first. Wanted to watch my face when I realized I'd been caught. She's enjoying this too much to rush it. But she will tell him. Tonight, probably. She's having dinner with him tonight, and she'll tell him then because it'll hurt me more if I have to sit through an entire day knowing it's coming." "Can you get out?" John asked. "Leave the house. Meet me somewhere." "No," Nadia said. "Leila's already made sure I have obligations today that keep me visible. Meetings. Appointments. Things that would be noticed if I missed them. She's backing me into a corner so I can't run before Rashid finds out." "Then I'm coming to you," John said. "You can't," Nadia said. "The house is fortress. You'd never make it past the gate." "Watch me," John said, and hung up. He didn't go to the house. That would have been stupid, and John had survived 9 years by generally not being stupid. Instead, he went to the restaurant where Leila and Rashid were having dinner, a place called Cedars that specialized in Lebanese cuisine and was owned by a cousin of Rashid's who let family use the private dining room for sensitive conversations. John bribed the sous chef with enough money to make questions seem unnecessary, got himself hired as temporary serving staff for the evening, and walked into the private dining room carrying a plate of kibbeh and enough concealed surveillance equipment to record whatever Leila was planning to tell Rashid. He served them with the invisible efficiency of good waitstaff, and he watched Leila watch him with an expression that suggested she knew exactly who he was even though they'd never met. She was older than Nadia, probably mid-40s, with the kind of austere beauty that came from perfect bone structure and zero tolerance for inefficiency. Her eyes were calculating, and when John poured her wine she smiled at him with a coldness that made him understand why she was good at intelligence work. Rashid was exactly what John had expected, wealthy, confident, comfortable in his power, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He had gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than frowned, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd looked cruel. He looked like someone's favorite uncle. Someone who'd lend you money and give you advice and maybe help you hide a body if you really needed it. John left the room and listened through the surveillance equipment as Leila waited until after the appetizers to begin her revelation. "I need to tell you something about Nadia," she said, and her voice carried satisfaction that made John's hands clench. "Something I've discovered that concerns the family's reputation and your honor." "What has she done?" Rashid asked, and his tone was careful, neutral, giving nothing away. "She's been unfaithful," Leila said. "For 3 months. With a man she met at a bookstore. I have photographs. Video. Complete documentation of their relationship." There was a long silence, and John waited for Rashid's response with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for targets he was about to kill. When Rashid finally spoke, his voice was quiet, which was worse than if he'd been angry. "Show me." John listened to Leila describe the evidence, heard Rashid ask questions about timeline and locations and whether Nadia knew she'd been caught. And when Leila said that Nadia had been informed that morning, John heard Rashid's sharp intake of breath and knew that this had been a mistake on Leila's part. Rashid didn't like being the last to know things, even when those things were about his own family. "You told her before telling me," Rashid said. "I wanted her to suffer," Leila said. "Wanted her to spend the day knowing what was coming." "That was not your decision to make," Rashid said, and now there was an edge in his voice. "Information about family comes to me first. Always. You know this." "I thought. You thought wrong, Rashid interrupted. And now Nadia has had an entire day to prepare, to contact this man, to make arrangements. You've given her time when I needed surprise. John smiled despite the situation, because Leila had just made a tactical error, and tactical errors created opportunities. He finished his shift, collected his pay, and left the restaurant before Rashid could finish dinner and start making calls to deal with his wife's infidelity. He called Nadia from his car. Rashid knows. But he's angry at Leila for telling you first. That buys us maybe 12 hours before he decides how to handle this. 12 hours to do what? Nadia asked. To give him a bigger problem than his wife's affair, John said. Something that makes dealing with me seem less important than dealing with an actual threat to his business. What kind of threat? Nadia asked. The kind that makes him vulnerable to his rivals, John said. I'm going to start a war between the Al-Nazari family and the Russians who were at that meeting. And while Rashid's busy dealing with that, we're going to disappear. How are you going to start a war? Nadia asked. By killing someone important and making it look like the Russians did it, John said. Which is pretty much what I do professionally, just with different motivation. John, Nadia said, and her voice carried warning. If you do this, there's no going back. Rashid will never stop looking for you. For us. I know, John said. But I'm very good at not being found. And you're very good at pretending to be someone you're not. Between your acting skills and my violence skills, we might actually survive this. That's not a plan, Nadia said. That's optimistic chaos. It's all I've got, John said. Unless you want to stay married to Rashid and let him punish you for having feelings for someone else. I really don't want that, Nadia said. Then pack a bag, John said. Minimal items. Nothing sentimental that can be traced. And be ready to run when I call you. John, Nadia said. I'm sorry. For lying. For putting you in this position. For falling in love with you when I had no right to fall in love with anyone. I'm not, John said. Sorry, I mean. Because meeting you is the best thing that's happened to me in 9 years of doing terrible things for money. So even if this ends badly, at least it'll end for something that mattered. He hung up and started planning murder, which was familiar territory but had never felt this personal before. Usually killing was mechanical, a problem requiring a solution, bodies as obstacles to be removed. But this time he was killing to protect someone, and that made the violence feel less like work and more like purpose. The target was Dmitry Volkov, nephew of the Russian family's patriarch, responsible for coordinating drug shipments through the port that both the Russians and Al-Nazaris used for smuggling operations. Killing Dmitry would hurt the Russians economically, and if John made it look like the Al-Nazaris had ordered the hit to gain exclusive port access, the Russians would retaliate against Rashid instead of trying to negotiate. And while Rashid was busy defending his territory and his business relationships, John and Nadia would have time to disappear before Rashid remembered he was also supposed to be killing the man who'd slept with his wife. John completed the contract on Dmitry 3 days later, clean and professional, with enough evidence left behind to point toward Al-Nazari involvement that it would look like someone had tried to be subtle but failed. A burner phone with texts to an Al-Nazari lieutenant. A partial fingerprint that matched one of Rashid's enforcers. The kind of evidence that was almost too convenient but would be convincing enough to trigger retaliation because the Russians would want an excuse to move against Rashid anyway, and this gave them justification. The Russians retaliated exactly as John had predicted, hitting 3 Al-Nazari businesses in one night, causing enough damage and chaos that Rashid had to mobilize his entire organization to respond. And while Rashid was coordinating defensive measures and counterattacks, John called Nadia and said 2 words, "Time to go." She met him at a predetermined location, carrying a single bag and wearing clothes that made her look completely different from the woman John had met at a book auction. No makeup. Hair in a simple ponytail. Jeans and a jacket that could belong to anyone. She looked younger and scared and absolutely furious. "Leila knows it was you," she said as soon as she got in the car. She figured out that the Russian hit was too convenient. "She's telling Rashid right now that you engineered this war to create cover for taking me. Is she right?" John asked. Obviously she's right, Nadia said. But Rashid's too busy dealing with the Russians to send people after us yet. How long do we have? 48 hours, John said. Maybe less. Depends on how quickly Rashid can stabilize the situation with the Russians and how much he values revenge versus practical survival. Where are we going? Nadia asked. Somewhere neither of our families can reach us, John said. Which is harder than it sounds, but I know people who specialize in making people disappear. They drove through the night, and somewhere around Pennsylvania Nadia asked the question John had been waiting for. Do you regret this? Meeting me? Getting involved with someone who came with this much baggage? No, John said. But ask me again in 48 hours when we know if we're going to survive Rashid's response. Fair, Nadia said. For what it's worth, I don't regret you either. I regret lying to you. I regret putting you in danger. But I don't regret falling in love with you, even though falling in love with you was probably the most selfish thing I've ever done. Why selfish? John asked. Because I knew it couldn't last, Nadia said. I knew eventually Rashid would find out and you'd either run or die, and I'd lose you either way. But I did it anyway because for 3 months I got to pretend I was someone who could just love someone without it being about family alliances or business strategy or sharing a husband with a woman who hates me. And that was worth whatever consequences come next. John reached over and took her hand, and they drove in silence while the sun came up over a landscape that looked nothing like New York and everything like possibility. They made it to the safe house John had arranged through contacts who owed him favors and didn't ask questions. It was in rural Montana, which was about as far from Lebanese crime families as you could get while still being in the United States. No internet. No cell signal. Just land and sky and the kind of isolation that was either peaceful or terrifying depending on your perspective. We're hiding in Montana, Nadia said, looking at the landscape with an expression John couldn't quite read. This is our grand plan. Rural Montana. It's temporary, John said. Until I can arrange permanent relocations with new identities. How long is temporary? Nadia asked. Weeks, John said. Maybe months. Depends on how persistent Rashid is about finding us. He'll be very persistent, Nadia said. You embarrassed him. Made him look weak to the Russians and to his own people. He won't stop until he's found us and made an example of what happens to people who make him look weak. Then we need to make sure he never finds us, John said. They settled into the safe house with the awkward uncertainty of people who'd been having an affair and were now suddenly living together under circumstances neither of them had planned for. Nadia tried to cook in a kitchen that had minimal equipment, and John tried to not think about the fact that he'd just destroyed his entire professional network and made himself a target of an organization that had resources he couldn't match. On the third day, John's handler called on the one phone line that still worked at the safe house. You've made some interesting enemies, the handler said. Rashid Al-Nazari has put out a contract on you. $1 million. Open invitation to anyone who can deliver proof of your death. That's more than I usually charge, John said. It's also enough money that every independent operator in the country is going to be looking for you, the handler said. You need to leave the country. Tonight if possible. Because staying in the United States means eventually someone's going to find you, and $1 million is enough motivation to make that eventually happen sooner rather than later. I can't leave yet, John said. I need time to arrange identities. Then you better arrange them fast, the handler said. Because Rashid's also hired some of the best trackers in the business. People who specialize in finding people who don't want to be found. And they're very good at what they do. The handler hung up, and John told Nadia what he'd learned. She took the information with the kind of calm that suggested she'd been expecting it. So we run. Again. Forever probably, because Rashid's not going to give up after a few months. Unless I eliminate the problem, John said. You mean kill Rashid, Nadia said. Which would mean going back to New York and fighting through his security to get to him. Which is suicide. Probably, John agreed. But it's the only way this ends without us spending the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. I can't ask you to do that, Nadia said. You're not asking, John said. I'm offering. Because living in hiding with you is better than living normally without you, but living freely with you would be even better. And the only way we get to live freely is if Rashid's not around to keep hunting us. He's my husband, Nadia said. Legally. And despite everything, he's never been deliberately cruel to me. Just indifferent. I married him knowing what he was. I can't ask someone to kill him because I fell in love with someone else. You're not asking, John said again. I'm deciding. Because I've killed 23 people in 9 years for money and strategy, and because someone else thought those people needed to die. And I'm tired of killing for other people's reasons. If I'm going to kill someone this time, I want it to be for something that actually matters to me. Nadia was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother wiping away. This is insane. We're insane. Two people who've known each other for 3 months and we're talking about murder and running and throwing away our entire lives because we can't stop sleeping together. It's not just about sex, John said. I know, Nadia said. That's what makes it worse. If it was just sex, we could walk away. But it's not. It's you reading Rilke and actually understanding what it means. It's you making me laugh when I'm trying to be serious. It's you looking at me like I'm not just someone's second wife or someone's business asset but an actual person who might be worth knowing. And I can't walk away from that. Even though walking away would be smarter and safer and probably what someone who wasn't completely destroyed by their own feelings would do. John pulled her close, and she let him, and they stood in a kitchen in rural Montana holding each other while the sun set outside, and somewhere in New York Rashid Al-Nazari was mobilizing resources to find them and make sure they both understood the consequences of making him look weak. We have 48 hours, John said into her hair. Maybe less. And then we need to make a choice. Run and hope we stay ahead of him forever. Or fight and hope I'm good enough to actually win against an entire organization. What do you want to do? Nadia asked. I want to give you the life you told me you wanted, John said. The one where you're not constantly performing for family appearances or sharing your husband with someone who resents your existence. The one where you can read books and have terrible taste in coffee and laugh without wondering if someone's recording it for leverage. And the only way I can give you that life is if Rashid stops existing. So we fight, Nadia said. We fight, John confirmed. She kissed him then, and it tasted like salt and desperation and the kind of commitment that people make when they know the odds are terrible but the alternative is worse. And when they pulled apart, Nadia said something that made John realize she was significantly more dangerous than he'd given her credit for. If you're going to kill Rashid, you'll need inside information. Security schedules. Routines. Vulnerabilities that only someone who's lived in his house would know. And you'll need a distraction, something that pulls his security detail away from him at exactly the right moment. She smiled, and it wasn't the smile John had fallen in love with at the book auction. It was something harder. Colder. You'll need me. Not as someone to protect, but as someone who can help you plan this properly. You want to help me kill your husband, John said. I want to help us survive, Nadia corrected. Rashid's going to kill both of us if we don't kill him first. And I'd rather be complicit in survival than a victim of someone else's revenge. So yes, I'm going to help you plan how to eliminate my husband. And I'm going to use everything I learned living in his house and watching his organization to make sure you actually succeed instead of just dying heroically while making the attempt. And this is where part 1 ends, because Nadia and John are about to plan something that will either free them or destroy them, and you're going to want to see part 2 to find out which one happens. But before you go, I need you to hit that subscribe button, because part 2 is going to be even more intense than this, and you'll want to know the moment it drops. And I need you to answer a question in the comments. If someone you loved was trapped in a life they never chose, and the only way to free them was to kill someone they promised to stay with, would you do it? Is love a strong enough reason to commit murder? Or is murder always wrong regardless of the motivation? Tell me in the comments. Be honest. Be thoughtful. Because John and Nadia are facing that exact question, and your answer might help them figure out what kind of people they're choosing to become. Until part 2, remember that love isn't always gentle or safe or morally uncomplicated. Sometimes love is two people making terrible choices because the alternative is living without each other. And sometimes that's enough.